Jordan, could you just maybe give a brief summary of the kind of the source code problem that you see as being like the game is fundamentally broken at the foundational level when you talk about it at the source code or at the deepest core?
Yeah,
Is there any
this
way?
is fun because from a neurosurgery perspective, what you're doing is you're asking me to go back from a place of metanoia back through that metanoia portal and try to figure
Yeah.
out how to say it again. So this is, I mean, why not? So one way of looking at it, there's a lot of different ways of saying it, but one way of looking at it is something like, for a very long time, depending on your point of view of time, maybe forever up until recently, um, the fundamental hurdle, the challenge that individuals and groups face is scarcity. Scarcity in terms of not enough, and particularly not enough things like food and water, or energy or shelter. You can go out from there, but it's scarcity. And everything that we do and everything that we've done has been an effort to figure out how to get out of that problem. Right? So how do we work together to make more food? And also, by the way, how do we protect the food that we've produced against other people who might want to use taking ours as a way of solving their problem? Right? And that's a long, hard problem to solve. And the sort of the general solution to that problem, as it's migrated through time, is what I've called in the past. I've used the term game aid to describe that. So the way of resolving the problem of scarcity and all of its different variations and all the feedback loops as other people are solving it their own way. Recently, we've begun to move into a zone, let's say starting in the 20th century and then increasingly over time, where the problem is not so much scarcity, but the tools of scarcity that we've used to resolve the problem of scarcity. Because the tools assume something about the nature of who we are and the nature of the problems we want to solve in the world and how we're going to about solving them. So that there's a scarcity mentality and a scarcity toolkit that is used to address the scarcity problem. But now the problem is actually the toolkit and the mentality. For example, we talked a lot about the idea of rivalrous versus anti-rivalrous. So rivalrous is an economic term that refers to things like a classic example would be like an apple. If you have an apple and I want the apple, the only way that I can have it is if you no longer have it. And if I consume it, it's gone forever. So that's a rivalrous object, something which is intrinsically scarce. Anti-rivalrous, I'll just kind of leap through the portal, would be something like the gospel, where if you've got the gospel and you give me the gospel, now we both have the gospel and it's more valuable the more deeply we enter into relationship with it. So anti-rivalrous. And the idea is that we've been playing for a very long time with how to navigate the rivalrous and using various kinds of tools like capitalism, carrot and stick incentive landscapes with, if you don't work, if those who work the hardest and the best get the highest rewards, those who don't get the least rewards and sometimes end up being impoverished and therefore have, marginal stuff. So carrot and stick, for example, that'd be a classic tool of the scarcity mentality. And we were quite successful in figuring out how to solve the problem of scarcity. This is something I've actually talked about recently by producing a very large amount of scarce things. But because we haven't actually solved the problem of the scarcity mentality and the scarcity toolkit, what we do is we produce very large heaping piles of scarce things, but we still relate to them through the lens of scarcity. I've called this opulence. It's kind of the golden toilet problem or the gigantic pile of food. So instead of saying, hey, we actually don't need a gigantic pile of food, we need enough food that people have what they need. We definitely don't need gold toilets. We just need to have the ability to get rid of waste effectively. What does it look like to build a different approach? So that's a huge thing. But the point is that was the kind of story that I was talking about 10 years ago. And the methodology, the way of solving it was something like, we have to get better at forming what we call I actually use the term collective intelligence. Like
Mhm.
when two or three people get together and they start to collaborate, something happens in that collaboration, which is more than the sum of the parts. So a team produces a synergy of perception. They can perceive more of reality, a synergy of imagination, and a synergy of execution. that is larger than the sum of the parts, right? So, hey, that's a collective intelligence. And so the idea was we need to find a way to go to a new form of collective intelligence by using, for example, the internet and AI and things like that, and other stuff as well. Not just hard technology, to produce a form of collective intelligence that has not been seen before on Earth, that has the ability to navigate the problem of scarcity and migrate us into this domain of abundance. Um, that's very complicated. That's a lot. And so on the other side of metanoia, this is going to sound extremely silly almost, but the point is that it's hyper silly. This is bigger than silly. Now all I do is I say, I need to discern what God wants and then do it. And all that other stuff is a very, very complicated way of usurping a responsibility that is not mine. It's Saul.
Mhm.
All of that other stuff is basically Saul, very much
Yeah.
Saul. I'm taking the spot of king, and I'm taking the responsibility of figuring out what to do that is right to the best of my ability. And the point is, all of that is actually going the wrong direction. So that's a pretty big shift, actually.
Absolutely. It's a massive, like, personal narrative shift, but your personal transformation to me, and I'm so glad you set it up that way, because I think this gets at underneath the thing that I wanted to talk with you both about, because what I hear you describing is, Civilization Game A ran under or has had several, probably more than we can count, narratives that keep the religio, the thing that binds and unites, running. So you have different religios for the different civilizations from the Bronze Age onward, right? Tainter talks about, the two primary conflicting narratives about what civilization is. You've got conflict theory, right, which all the way downstream of that is, Marxism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, that story that says the thing that's actually keeping us together. How in the world is it that I take my trash out, I put it at the end of my curb on Thursday night, some random stranger comes and gets it Friday morning. I drop my kids off at a school in which I have no relatives that work at that school. I don't really even know the teachers that well. They go to a Lutheran or a Christian high school, so I have a general sense there might be some values overlap there. And then I go to the grocery store, and it's just stocked with food, like, all the time. And this thing just keeps running. And so we have a couple different stories as to what is the invisible thing that kind of keeps that thing running. And I think what I found fascinating about you, Jordan, was the way in which you saw, okay, I think there's something that's keeping this thing running in its best and optimal way. And there's a narrative that would hold this thing together temporarily that inevitably will lead to collapse if we don't get the right religio, the thing that would bind it all together properly. So if it's actually conflict, and what we're really dealing with here is, I am oppressing the garbage man. I'm oppressing the person that's, filling my grocery bags. All it is oppressor oppression dynamics. And what we have at our core is this zero sum game. That narrative, as it disseminates through civilization, ends up, like, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. It feels like that will inevitably lead to collapse as that thing spreads. So when you talk about metanoia, pivoting your own personal, like, narrative identity, and then giving you a new lens to maybe see what the most optimal story to keep the functionalist perspective together, the thing that says
Mm.
what we're doing together is actually mutual self-sacrifice. What we're actually doing together is finding a way for me to say, I'm going to contribute to your good, even though you're not my blood kin, in a way that I'm just kind of acting out on faith. And you might say, well, yeah, there's a financial attachment to you doing your job and your role in society. But even that's an act of faith. Like, you get your paycheck after you do the work. And what's the work? I'm sacrificing my time, my energy for the sake of someone else. I I want to pull you into this, Rafe, because I'm just curious how, for you, what was it in, like, evolve, move, play? What was the thing you were trying to get at? And kind of on the other side of your journey of transformation, how do you look at that work? How are you looking ahead towards that what once felt like a sense of calling? What where's the religio in it all? What is the thing that binds, unites, and holds? And I don't know, where are you at?
Yeah. I was listening to Jordan describe his journey, and I was thinking about uh, the sense of like, what is the through line, or how do we see the distinction between these two journeys that have some similarity but also some distinction within the kind of space of these conversations? I think what is perhaps unique about me is I do think at the systemic level, and I'm very interested at the civilizational level and the historical level. But my work is grounded in physical things, in running and jumping and climbing, and how those transform individuals right away. And I think this curiosity for me has always been something like there's a reality out there, and human beings have a constrained nature that is in relationship to that reality. And we can live to express that in the best way possible, or we can live to try to escape it. And escape, I think, is fundamentally the wrong orientation that ultimately leads towards suffering. So C.S. Lewis talks about this in The Abolition of Man, right? Traditional philosophy asks us to, how do I live in accordance with nature, in accordance with the Tao? Whereas the technological worldview asks, how do I bend nature to my own will? So I think that in the community that I grew up in, there was maybe even this, I don't know if this is true, but this feels interesting at the moment for me, is the sense that there's obviously I grew up in the counterculture, the hippie movement, new age spirituality. And there's a sense that this was a return to the land, right? This is a reclaiming of our relationship to Mother Nature. And yet at the same time, I think it had this egoistic drive to overcome that was not fully metabolized. And I think that they saw Eastern spirituality as a set of technologies that can free the self from constraint. And that ultimately led to an enormous amount of narcissism and very dysfunctional patterns of behavior with people. And, obviously, like, I think one of the persistent constraints that spiritual people try to escape, spiritual in the sense of people who are seeking something. One of the ones that we get stuck on a lot is sexuality. And the idea is that we could escape, right? People want to escape jealousy. They want to escape aging. They want to be able to be horny 18-year-olds with a buffet of sexual partners for the entirety of their life, or to achieve that, which they never achieved in the first place. And that, that was really a current within the counterculture that I think was extremely destructive. It's a current within our current culture that I think is extremely destructive. And it takes people away from recognizing the way in which they live with constraint, that they are going to age, that they are going to shift roles, that they are going to move from being a young person in the mode of courtship to being a mature person in the mode of fatherhood and marriage. And so I saw that in my father, and I wanted to not be like him. So I formed my image of the world basically in a negative. And that sustained me for a certain period of time, but it didn't actually result in a happy and beautiful marriage. And it left cracks between me and my children. And so through Jordan Peterson, I discovered an idea of Christ that seemed to help me guide me to a better place, to a place of really a place of positive sum thinking in relationship to my marriage. That was actually a big part of what Jordan gave me. And then when I discovered John and the concept of agape, that was like, this is what fatherhood is. This is what real commitment to marriage is. And so my metanoia, when I committed myself fully to the process of Christianity, it was recognizing that I couldn't actually cultivate the virtue on my own to solve these patterns of generational sin that had been handed down to me, and that I needed a force that was greater than me to guide me and hold me in that process. And that I also needed to fundamentally accept myself as a sacrifice to the pain that had preceded me, and that Christ was the ultimate exemplar of that. That if I could walk with Christ, then I could willingly accept the cross of the sexual abuse that I experienced and that was passed down through my family, and the way that my father neglected me. And I could say, I will be the sacrifice to break this pattern going into the future. So I've gotten a little bit lost in the question. That tends to happen. There's a lot to process in these questions. But you asked me, what does my work with evolved move play look like on the other side of this metanoia? For me, it's still the same question. I think that still I fundamentally am in this place of, what does it mean to accept nature as it is, and then to live into the best exemplification of it? And strangely, I find that that's where I'm stuck with Christianity, where I've actually sort of bounced out on the other side, is because the promise of eternal life seems to me like an escape from the acceptance of constraint. And there's just certain things about the Christian message as I dig into it that seem not to accept some of the constraints of our nature that I think we have to deal with. And I'm not sure. I kind of feel like I'm a little bit of I feel very immature in having this conversation. Like I went to catechumen class a couple weeks ago, and they were saying, like, when you're new, like, be really careful about putting your testimony out into the world. And there's a part of me that feels like I'm struggling with the things that cradle Christians struggle with when they're intelligent 14-year-olds. And I don't know what I will be on the other side of that struggle. Like, maybe I'll be like where David Bentley Hart is, or maybe I'll be where John Vervaeke is. And I'm not wise enough as of yet to know where that path leads. So it's an interesting thing for me to take a platform and stand here and talk to the world about it. But I'll do what I can.
Yeah.
Well, only insofar as you feel comfortable talking about it, Rafe. And again, I don't want to frame this as you speaking from a place of like mastery, of like ascendancy to some state in which you feel like you have to speak authoritatively. I think it's really helpful insofar as you feel comfortable speaking from your journey to just share your observations about it, because it's really, really important. Your observations and what you're seeing are sometimes things that would cradle Christians, or I don't know, people that aren't being as honest about the struggles with this thing sometimes will overlook. And we need to hear from this place. I think I want to recap a couple things you said and allow Jordan to tag in. I would say the interesting thing I hear you talking about, Rafe, is the relationship to nature. So, C.S. Lewis called nature our sister. There's a component of, and this is, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Rafe, but I'll confess this is a part of my own struggle. And I think this is a long struggle with the Christian story. You mentioned even like human sexuality, for example, and when the Christians, when Christianity was spreading to the Roman Empire, it was that there was a sexual ethic that was quite countercultural, that felt against nature in some sense. And we talked about this last time. It felt against my biological proclivity. I am my plumbing and my psychology are not necessarily hardwired for monogamy. That's that's a point of tension. And so for someone that's trying to find and say, I want adherence to a way to the Tao, right? I want adherence to reality. That's what I hear you saying. It's like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to live in keeping with reality. I don't want to have a skewed vision of it or relationship to it. And I want to go with the grain of reality and not against. And I feel like that's, Jordan, what you're talking about with Civilization Game A is the sense in which much of that engine seems to be going against the grain of reality, that there's a higher ordered reality that that thing might be brushing up against. And so what I hear you talking about, Rafe, and, you know, and both of you feel free to tag in after this, is okay, there's an epistemology question. So there's a question of how do I know what reality with a capital R looks like? What are the methods? Everything from what Christians would say are the methodologies of general revelation and special revelation. So when I make these observations about human nature and, you know, like we'll just stick with sexuality for a moment. The fact that I have this hardwiring and that testosterone seems to function in such a way that it makes me more aggressive and it makes me more apt to want to procreate with more than one woman. That thing seems to be in the nature, so to speak. But this is where the weird dilemma of the Christian story enters, in that the story starts with the inherent goodness of creation, and yet it also introduces by the second chapter this concept that there is something not right with nature at the same time. And it's kind of in that dance that is really difficult. What is the thing that we name as the goodness of nature and the created order? What is that which we would say is the fall? Like it isn't going with where the telos of creation is headed. So when I think about, this is what we talked about last time a little bit, Rafe, was like, okay, we compare the polygamous cultures to ones that maybe hold to something akin to a Christian sexual ethic. And I ask, okay, which one seems to be going with the intended grain of reality? And there are some factors that I look at and I go, I don't think that the polygamy thing actually does that, because I see, all right, we cut out large swaths of men from the mating pool. And what do? They turn to violence. They turn to crime. They they turn to things that we would say we wouldn't want around us as neighbors.
We
And
should
then I
point out
compare
they
that
turn
with what,
to
go ahead,
they
Jordan.
turn to reciprocal escalating violence, because
Yes.
the easiest way to get more wives is to take them from other groups of men. And
Yeah.
so those who become violent, if they become effective at violence, then they become successful at causing other men to have to become effective at violence. And this creates an arms race.
Yeah.
They also redirect sexual energy towards children.
Yeah,
That's a
that's
common
right.
pattern. You see
Common
that,
pattern.
you know, like it's really shocking for me. It's really difficult for me, particularly given my background, to like read the Platonic dialogues and notice that it is just considered sort of normative that erotic desire is primarily oriented towards teen boys. That's terrifying, or like just really horrific. But we see this pattern cross culturally. But Paul, had you finished your thought, or do you
I
want
apologize.
to go first?
I interrupted you.
Please jump in.
Well, I could say that one of the things that I was seeing was, well, there's one image was the image of the difference between, or how biological life plays in the context of energy. I guess I was seeing Ilya as we have these non-dissipative structures. There's something about reality, sort of first order, that has thermodynamic characteristics. Entropy declines, right? Second law. But then there's something that about reality, second order, that recognizes that there are ways to play inside that gap to produce structures that are able to continue to perpetuate and move in that space. And that was just to say something like the nature of nature is not obvious. That's the first image. But then the second image was the relationship between Ion or eternity and Chronos. And I think that ends up being very profoundly fundamental. And I think it's very closely tied to the notion of the fall. If you're looking at reality through the lens of Chronos, then you're looking at a kind of reality that is defined by a whole set of presuppositions, some of which might be, for example, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and play the game of polygamy because I think I can win in the short term, and kind of like, who cares about what happens 1,000 years from now? Right. If you're looking at reality through the lens of Chronos, then the local and the global, the short term and the long term, become extremely distinct. Obviously, if you're looking at reality through the lens of eternity, that entire set of questions completely goes away. They're not even the kind of thing that you can conceive of. You can only look for that which would be the eternal global. And that difference makes a big difference, because if you premise that eternity is more real than Chronos, that Chronos sits within eternity and is produced by and supported by eternity, then you will then notice that a lot of questions resolve to singularities, that the Christian sexual ethic reveals itself as being fully in alignment with reality qua eternity.
So I like that. I like that, Jordan, those distinctions, though I'd like to play with them, but I want to, I guess, look at it more evolutionary and more kind of at a personal level.
Mhm.
I was at an estuary meeting recently, and we were there was one of the folks there was a biblical literalist, and I found his perspective quite challenging. And he was saying sin is easier. Like, obviously, we live in Satan's playpen because sin is easier, and I was like, I don't think it is, right? Like, like whatever happened and changed, right? Like, the sense that I'm, by nature designed to seek out lots of women, that really isn't very strong for me, right? The sense that I am by design, in some sense, meant to elevate love in a connection that is only available with one woman, and ideally the only woman that you'll ever be with. That actually feels more real to me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the way that I've thought about this from an evolutionary perspective is evolution provided us with some sort of general purpose drives, right? It's like, I can't find my one woman unless I'm attracted to women in general. And it's not that there's anything wrong with me feeling attraction to women. It's just that I need to understand the higher purpose that is only expressed through my marriage. It's sort of like, for some reason, the analogy that pops into my head is if sexuality is like an appetizer and marriage is the meal, right? And if you don't understand the
Or
meal
sexuality is like the notion of sweet,
yeah,
and nutrition is
exactly.
Marriage is nutrition.
Marriage is
Sweet
nutrition.
serves the purpose of orienting us towards proper nutrition. It's not an end in itself.
Yeah, and so if you sensitize yourself to what actually feels nourishing, then the salience of all the sweet falls away, right? And so I have the sense that people say, oh, monogamy is not natural. But I think monogamy is as natural as polygyny, right? We have a pair bond. We have this aspirational thing. Like, people, when they fall in love, say things like, I want to be with you forever. They have those feelings. Those feelings arose for a reason. Now, we also live with the reality that, like, in evolutionary times, a lot of our partners would die. And we had to figure things out. And people are imperfect, and they break and change. So we're prepared to be able to adjust. And we can operate in some sense in a way that brings us to the best aspect of our nature and the worst aspects of our nature. They're both natural, right? It's like lifelong, virtuous, marriage is natural and rape is natural, right? It's there in us. It's about, which is the problem though, because then we don't have the orienting principle to say what is the good of the nature that we should orient towards. And
You need
this
a
is
hermeneutic key
yeah,
to read it properly, right?
yeah,
Like in
Yeah,
the
you need
old
something
little,
that puts
like
things in a
back of the
hierarchical.
cereal, the back of the cereal, you get the secret decoder ring, right? Like
yeah,
you need a hermeneutic lens to actually read reality, read nature properly.
This, by the way, this is what the concept of sacred is. That's what the concept of sacred
yeah,
means. Like if you
yeah.
boil it down to its most basic element, the image I keep having in my head is like, imagine a line segment. It's 3 inches long, it's just a little line segment. As soon as you put an arrow on the line segment, so it now becomes a ray pointing in a direction, you now have directionality in reality. Sacred, setting aside, setting apart, making distinction, characterizing as different and orienting is the hermeneutic key that allows one to distinguish between sweet and nutrition as distinct and as having a hierarchical relationship, one higher than the other.
How do we discover this element of the natural order in some sense? Like when you were talking earlier, Jordan, as you sort of gave your introduction about the systematic thinking that you're doing and escaping scarcity mindset, for some reason, my mind went to like the selfish gene, the Richard Dawkins view, right? And I was thinking about how, like I am very much an evolutionist, right? I believe in natural selection. I believe in the whole thing. And I think it's one of the most elegant and beautiful and powerful models we've ever created. And yet I think there are some base philosophical assumptions in it that may not be justified. And the primary one that I'm pointing to is this idea of non-teleological, right? I think that is an axiom that precedes the way that we think evolutionary, that's very useful in that sense, but is then treated as like ontologically prior to everything that we have to think about, when I don't think it actually is. And that if we can step away from that axiom for a second and allow it, what we see is that nature has actually been unfolding towards higher levels of capacity for complex cooperation.
Yes.
And that's what allows complexity. That's why we can have multicellular organisms. That's why we can have societies. That's how we can do all of these things. And if we assume the selfish gene framework not as a lens, but as the lens, it leads towards a moral ethos that none of us actually want to live within.
It also has the disadvantage of being false.
Sure.
Both bad and wrong simultaneously.
Bad and wrong. That's good. But nobody like I remember like when I went deep into the evolutionary theory, I'm like, why am I not like donating to every sperm bank that I can? Right? Like, how am I not? I'm not living up to the ethos that I've been told is the design of the organism. Right? The organism is to pass genes into the future, and I'm,
You should also, by the way, be killing all or infertilizing all of the males. So
yeah.
There's a lot to follow. There's a lot.
I don't think you can fertilize males, Jordan. I think you may be a bit confused.
No, make them infertile. You can either make them infertile or kill them. You can do either one. Like if you make them infertile and enslave them, that's actually a better solution.
That's good.
Perfect. Dawkins is in the appendix of Dawkins' book.
Eunuchs.
Yeah, there you go.
Can I recap something you said here, Rafe?
Yeah.
Or go ahead. Do you need to finish your thought first? And then I've got a few things I've written down here that I want to see if this comes close to what you're saying.
Well, so monogamy then, I think, is like a key evolutionary principle that allows higher order replication of higher order bodies in some sense, right? We give up some of the identity that genetically propagates itself into the world to participate in the body of a society that is far more robust, and robust not simply in the sense of like it wins at the evolutionary game, but is actually fundamentally better for human thriving. And somehow our evolutionary paradigm seems largely at this stage to be not mature enough to capture what that is and why it matters so much. Whereas the Christian sexual ethos did. And I have my criticisms of Christianity if we can, but that the loss of the understanding of how incredibly powerful and beautiful and virtuous and what an engine of good marriages are is really like a problem.
Mhm. Okay, so a couple things that I I see as through lines here, and then Jordan, Rafe, give me your feedback on this. I don't know. What I hear you talking about, Rafe, is the fundamental tension. I want to circle back around to this conflict theory because underneath a pure Darwinian narrative, right? Underneath everything from Marx to the nature of postmodern deconstruction is this conflict theory that's built on an underlying assumption of scarcity. And the scarcity thing makes a lot of sense because the scarcity thing is probably passed down to us evolutionarily. Our ancestors, ancient ancestors, did live in a time of scarcity. And so when we think about everything from greed to lust to the things that in Christian language we would name as sins, many of which have to do with the way in which excuse me, the way in which we approach the world inappropriately from a place of scarcity, when in actuality the telos of creation is not a world of scarcity. It's a world of abundance. That's the vision of the kingdom of God. That's the picture at the end of Revelation where God descends into a city, which is really interesting. So there has been some things. I would caution, as a longtime Christian, I would speak about some of the ways in which uh, there are those who would claim, to be in the Christian story and Christian community that are actually like smuggling things like Gnosticism in. So when you talk about the way in which you feel it difficult, even notions of heaven feel like perhaps like an escape from reality. It's an escape from the scarcity to some sort of like spiritual platonic realm of abundance. But it doesn't make sense of how you're supposed to live here. It doesn't make sense of why we would work towards any sort of vision of the future for our children or grandchildren when the end goal is like this either rapture where we're getting beamed up out of here, or when we die we're taken to some platonic state. I would contend that that is not the original vision of the apostles. It's not the original vision of the church fathers. Obviously, we get into the ways in which Greek philosophy did play a vital role in the church fathers, especially as we get past the apostolic age. And so the idea that here's what I would say. Your gut reaction to be like, I have problems with a narrative that is framing salvation as escape is dead spot on. And that's why, Rafe, I say people that are in the world between worlds, in the liminal space, you're affording a really, really important insight from your particular vantage point right now. And that's to say, I've just come out of a world in which my counterculture and much of American counterculture has been built on this sort of neo-Gnosticism. So instead of it being some Platonic paradise, they frame nature. They frame the pre-civilizational state of nature as the idealistic. I mean, this is like the first Avatar movie, right? Is that if we can like strip back civilization, this is the conflict theory. This is why the conflict theory and Marxism, Marxism, post-colonialism, why it is incompatible to me with a Christian story, because the underlying premise is that what brings us all together, the thing that binds us, the religio that binds us, is fundamentally conflict, power, and oppression. And what the counterculture sought to do was to kind of say, here's the red pill. We can it'd be fun to talk about some of the ways in which the Matrix has influenced
Yes.
our seeing of the world right now. Take the red pill, escape to a state of nature, avatar style. We have a bunch of practices that are going to make you more attuned to nature. I think there's a role psychedelics play in this. And the goal is still some kind of, it's an escape from civilization, you know? And there's something to that. You know, Paul Kingsnorth's got a new book out called Against the Machine. And I see him processing this tension that we experience in Civilization Game A. And all I'm trying to say is I think the counterculture thing that was escape, I share this as a brother now, you know, as a
Yeah.
brother to say there is in certain Christian contexts a fundamentally still Gnostic story that has just borrowed Christian grammar to point to a salvation as escape story that I would say is antithetical to the core of what the way of Jesus is. And it's antithetical even to the Apostles' Creed. What are we looking forward to? This strange thing that I have to confess to you, I cannot wrap my mind around. I can't tell you the metaphysics of this. I don't understand it, but it's the resurrection of the dead. It's stepping into the picture of God in man, a city whose gates are never shut, and this beautiful picture of like in this city, the John the Revelator sees the kings of the nations bringing their gifts into the city. So it is not like this strange monoculture either. There is like the beauty of the culture of the nations, the kings of the world bringing their gifts into this redeemed, restored nature, civilization, God, man, kingdom of God, and our natural states brought into their fullness. So I'm just trying to frame that as the counter, and your suspicions of where you feel there might be Gnostic communication happening in Christian circles. It does happen, Rafe, and it's all over the place.
It
And
is.
we need to reform that as a
Yeah.
longtime Christian.
I've discovered this first person in the context that this is a almost like a central element of my church, the church that I am in, is wrestling with exactly that. And so everybody was more or less raised, not everybody, but many people were raised in
Yeah.
that context, in the context of escape. And sort of the simplest version of, I think he calls it password theology or password gospel. You know, here's a series of core like a key. The key has 5 or 6 elements to it. Get 5 of those 5 or 6 elements, hunker down during the shit show that is this world. You got your ticket and you're out of here. And then the good stuff happens thereafter, like a very
Fundamentally Gnostic.
back of the note card. So struggling against that is actually a big part of the theology. And it's not struggling because they don't like it. It's struggling because they recognize it's actually wrong. And it felt the consequences of that wrongness in life. But a little bit of how do you say, like a diagnosis of the Gnostic move is important because, and this requires some very careful slicing. In some sense, superficially, one might imagine that a call to nature, a call to the body, would be a very anti-Gnostic call. Right? Because superficially, we would say, well, the Gnostic says body's bad, the spirit or heaven is good, screw the body, go to heaven. Right? That's sort of the simplest Gnostic. But we have to recognize is that the Gnostic move creates tremendous sleight of hand. But what it does is it says, yeah, go to nature. But the nature it gives you is actually the nature of an image. Right? It's not real nature. It's an idealized nature that is ever actually going to be realized in life. And so it just calls heaven nature. It just takes the image of heaven, scratches out heaven, writes nature on top of it, and points at it with a slightly different aesthetic. So instead of looking like a city made of crystal, it looks like a bunch of trees, right? Or it looks like, an Edenic, a throwback to the garden. But the move is to recognize that as soon as we retreat into our own minds, as soon as we retreat into a world that we are fabricating, no matter what that fabrication calls itself or what it looks like, that's one big piece of the Gnostic move.
So I feel like this word Gnosticism is a bit fudgy, to use a Paul van der Clay term, right? And it's doing a lot of work here without necessarily being very refined. So, for instance, Jordan, you're talking about the image of nature as a replacement of the image of heaven. I don't think that has anything to do with not the Gnosticism of the 1st and 2nd century. That's the counterculture, right? And you can say that the counterculture sort of adopts elements of the Gnostic worldview and then replaces Eden with the natural.
Yeah, so I'm saying the Gnostic move. There's a thing that is more fundamental than the way that Gnosticism shows up in a given moment, which is the way that the Gnostic move in general.
But what I'm saying, Rafe, is not Gnostic. It doesn't necessarily have to be Gnostic metaphysics to have a Gnostic soteriology. So a Gnostic metaphysics is not necessarily required for us to say the way of salvation is playing into the Gnostic salvation path.
Yeah. What is the Gnostic salvation path in your view? Like, how is that different from Christianity?
Yeah. Secret knowledge that affords you escape from reality. It's a red pill. It's taking the red pill. It's the Matrix in all of its forms. It's the narrative of the Matrix to me in all its forms. It is here's the way you escape here, whether it's civilization, whether it's, a material world. That's why I put maybe Neo-Gnosticism, like double entendre there with Neo from the Matrix. It is how I avoid, like when I get really existential about this, Rafe, like beyond the metaphysics, I'm much more an existentialist. My day in and day out life, when I face hardship, when I see what's happening in the world around me, is the longing of my heart escape from it or renewal in the midst of it? The Christian story is renewal in the midst of it. It's water to wine, right? It is death and resurrection, bodily resurrection. So that's crucial. It's crucial as an archetype. It's crucial as a hermeneutic key. It is not, did you say the sinner's prayer? Did you learn the 5 spiritual laws so that when you die tonight, you can go to a disembodied paradise? That it's also, I'd say this too, Rafe, it's also not the solution to our anxiety about death.
So this is where I'm really hung up, right? If I'm honest, because that you're articulating, I love, right? That's the Christianity that I read through Jordan Peterson, and I read through John Vervaeke and through you and Jordan Yu and Jonathan Pageau and all these people. But as I read the Bible, that was not what seemed to actually be in it, right? To the best that I could understand it, right? So, in the David Bentley Hart translation of the New Testament, he makes a big, he draws out the distinction between the biblical use of the term sarx, which is flesh, right? Suke, which is sort of the animating spirit that we have when we're alive and don't have when we're dead. And pneuma, which is the sort of I think maybe it's like the eidos, the form, right? And there's some idea that we can be beings of this pneuma. And there's a doctrine, as far as I can understand, or dogma that we have a bodily resurrection at the end of the world. But like when Christ is asked about the kingdom of heaven, one question that he's asked is, a woman has had 7 husbands. Who will she be married to in the kingdom of heaven? And he says, they'll be spiritual beings. They'll be angels.
Okay, no.
Right?
Here's what I say, Rafe. I think he's saying they will be like the angels and not giving in marriage, right? And I would say, I've wrestled with that.
Yeah.
I'll just make some brief commentary about that, and then please continue.
Yeah.
I think, when we talk about the nature of sexuality and what does the telos of that look like, I think maybe the insinuation that in the setting right of all things, there may not be a need for that procreation function insofar as the way it's worked, and that marriage might in fact be a sort of temporary adaptation to help us deal with the fact that we've inherited programming from a world of scarcity as we move towards the ultimate state of abundance. And in between those phases, we deal with a mediated and a better use of those drives and desires together that serve the procreation function. They teach us something too about the nature of love, but that when we get to that point, think of all the violence, think of all of the hardship and pain around sexuality and love too. In that function, and that maybe I don't know. I'm not speaking authoritatively as it. I'm not a
Yeah.
New Testament
Well,
scholar, but
yeah. The message the sense that I read that in, and then in the rest of the context, was um, that the promise of the defeat of death is the eternal existence as creatures of Pneuma, not creatures of Sarx.
okay. So here's what what I would say to that, Rafe, is that if you go through, let's say, the book of Acts, so the Acts of the Apostles, and you look at every public sermon given by any of the apostles, none of them frame it that way. So none of them frame what repentance is even about, which means for me at least something as they're navigating what this means in out of Judea and into the Gentile world, in which in that Gentile world they're very familiar with Platonism and probably Middle Platonism at that time. That there are no appeals to that. There are no like what the old, traveling evangelists might say, if you got in a car accident tonight, do you know where you'd spend eternity, brother? You know, none of them frame the message of the kingdom of God like that. It's like times of refreshing. Like right now, there's a sense of imminence to what God is doing and the calling to participate in that now. And yes, there is a thread of what the trajectory of going against the grain of God's intended order for reality would lead to if left unattended and left, I should say, without being course corrected towards our proper telos. But I don't see a single one of the apostles talk about, they're not framing it as, dealing with your death anxiety. So here's how we deal with your death anxiety. When you die, don't worry, you'll exist as an eternal spiritual being someplace in the clouds. That is not the framing. That's not even what they're attempting to do. What they're attempting to describe and to correct is the end of civilization game A, right? So civilization game A, if we keep playing this game, Jerusalem, you could frame even Jesus's warning about the destruction of Jerusalem within Jordan's language, not to give Jordan too much credit here, but to say, you know, hey, you're playing this game a particular way. And do you know how it's going to end? Like it's going to end in Gehenna. What is Gehenna? Well, our New Testament, see, it's translated as hell all the time, but it's an Aramaic transliteration of the Valley of Hinnom. What's the Valley of Hinnom? It's where in 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem, they stacked the dead bodies to be burned. Where? In the Valley of Hinnom. Why? Oh, the Valley of Hinnom was also the place the Israelites were taking their children to be sacrificed to Molech. It was in the Valley of Hinnom. So his audience knows there's like an imminence and a future orientation to it. And I know, like, this is the hard part. I maybe speak as someone that you go, man, when I hear you talk about Paul or others or Paul Vanderklay, I go, that's the kind of people I want to be around. And I'd be like, all right, well, Rafe, let's just hang out more together. And,
Sure.
like,
I mean,
well,
I get it.
just check this out. I think this is
Go
really
ahead.
important. So let's take these things are very difficult to slice through. And I can even feel a little bit of I've had these kinds of struggles in the past. For me, one of the ones was around the classic predestination or human freedom problem. And the first order, the problem is that the faculty of understanding is inadequate to the problem. So this is not the kind of thing that you're going to figure out, no matter how much textual analysis or other smart guys you talk to, including people who happen to be on the screen, but other people as well, because it's not that kind of thing. It's just a different category. But for example, we've got this beautiful image of Babel and Babylon. And what I'm going to try to do here is to stack heaven and earth. because Babel is true, and Babylon is true, and Babylon is an image of Babel. And really, what I like very specifically, like the immanent. Take it from the point of view of the immanent. Take it from the point of view of a 900 BC reader who is reading the story of the fall of Babel, and he's living in the aftermath of the collapse of the Bronze Age. So he's actually living in the reality that is being talked about in Deuteronomy and in Genesis. And so he has these two images simultaneously. He's like, oh yeah, okay. He looks around and he sees that nobody's making bronze anymore because the structures that enabled the fabrication of bronze have broken down, and a fall occurred. And he's seeing everybody's now tribes, but there's ruins of vast, great cities. So he can see the image of, yeah, there once was towers. There once was humans building things. There were people who made a name for themselves. One second. How much longer do you think we have? My wife was asking if I should use one of my tokens to have her go pick up our daughter. The answer is yes. So we'll continue this conversation. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's great.
And just kind of be in the immanent, be in the lived, be in the reality that there were sort of tribes of dusty Hebrews running around in the valleys around Shiloh, and periodically being attacked by actual Philistines who are actual people who had tried to take over Egypt and got kicked out. Like, we're living in the historical reality. And then the image, or the image of Babel, the image of the spiritual reality, that there is something about a spirit that is an identity in reality that allows a multiplicity to come together into a lived wholeness. And that when that spirit has descended, and the word descent is metaphorical, obviously, but it's the right way of thinking about it. The spirit is descended and a team emerges, a really high functioning group of people come together, and they're able to move as one. And there's a felt sense of the reality of the larger and the whole to which you participate, which makes a whole bunch of choices about how you show up very obvious, right? The classic kind of sports metaphor of, don't win, the winner is not you, right? Win one for the team, sacrifice your own personal glory for the good of the team. That kind of stuff comes naturally when you're in the spirit that has descended from heaven, right? You're holding an image that has a hierarchical, proper, reality-based connection to the Trinity, to the highest. And then there's another thing that happens when we capture that kind of image and we purpose that image to our own ends. We make a name for ourselves. This is the first line. Remember, in Babel, it wasn't that they built the tower. It was that they sought to make a name for themselves, and therefore they built a tower. You make a name for yourselves. A name, a spirit, an identity, a wholeness. We bring ourselves together to produce a wholeness that is greater than ourselves. And by the way, solves a lot of the problems you were talking about earlier. How is it that I get the trash man to pick up the trash? Well, there's two ways of it happening, ultimately. All right. One way of happening is that somehow we are part of an alive whole that is actually an image from heaven that allows us to be really individually and collectively feeling the reality of it and making choices on the basis of that actual participation, which, by the way, is how your cells work together, right? They're part of an alive whole. They have an image. The other way is that we make a name for ourselves, right? We create a variety of different kinds of sociological feedback loops that combine the deployment of power and the unleashing of desire and things like that to coordinate people into something that simulates a whole. And that falls. That approach will always fail. That approach will always end up in something like a catastrophic collapse. And so we have the image of Babel, right, in Genesis. We have the image of something which is coming from heaven. What I mean by that is, I'm very Pageot in this. It's an actual pattern. And by the way, Michael Levin too is great here because he's kind of moving into space. It's an actual pattern that is real. Like it's not Platonic because Plato's not right, but it's better to think of it that way. That has a reality that is not bound to Chronos. It's bound to eternity, and it images itself in Chronos. And then we also have the actual instantiation of that pattern in the real city or empire of Babylon. And it plays out that pattern in a very particular way. And that very particular way leaves its mark in history and leaves its mark on the way that people live. And the reason why I want to bring that up is that what we see here is not that these things are separated. It's not that Babel is true and Babylon is false. And it's not that Babylon is true and Babel is false. It's that the relationship between Babel and Babylon is where truth is. This is like when Christ says, I am the truth. That is a
Yeah.
jaw-dropping, bottom of reality dropping out thing, because you're like, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense. That's not even a construct. You can't say that. I, a subject, am the truth, an object, right? I am an object. Subject is object. That's what that phrase says. It's a pure paradox. But once you recognize it, that it in fact precisely points to the reality that it's in the relationship between heaven and earth that the word reality finds its proper meaning, then a lot of these paradoxes begin to drop out. And a lot of the challenges that we find in theology are found in the failure to actually live that way, to live in a Trinitarian ethos, to live in a fashion where the relationality is the ground of reality, and it's never going to be found in the law of excluded middle. Sorry,
Because
long
he also
diatribe.
partners with that expression of I am the truth, I am the way, truth,
And the
and the
life.
life,
And the life.
and the
Yeah.
life, right? And there's an exclusivity claim there as well, which can be difficult, right? I mean, it's difficult on multiple levels, but it doesn't. Difficulty for me, kind of like, I don't know, it is not as difficult when I understand that there is a way to do math.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to go on another diatribe, but you could short circuit it. The way I just was talking to my wife about it is something like, there's a way to light a match.
Yeah.
Like,
So,
if
I
you want to
mean,
light a match, you do it this way and it works. Like, why is that complicated?
Yeah.
what I hear in that, Jordan, was really a meditation on universals and particulars, right? The pattern
Beautiful. Yeah.
of Babel is a universal. It is a sort of like a structural constraint of human social organization that we can stumble into over and over and over again. And it's exemplified in the Bible through the historical particular of Babylon, which did in fact not just symbolically in the Bible, but it did in fact historically actually exemplify the pattern to some degree, right? It is a real thing that the pattern and the historical thing actually met in some sense. There is what I hear as your claim. I don't particularly have a problem with that kind of thinking about Christianity. I found it to be immensely valuable. Where I find myself struggling, I suppose, is if it's interesting to go there, even like, I don't know if that's the conversation we want to have, but I suppose what I notice in myself is because of where I'm at right now, like the energy in me gets into this place of like almost a little fighty energy and a little like heart achy, like tenderness energy that wants to be like, but this thing, right? This is where I'm struggling, because I find myself in that struggle. And when I was at this estuary meeting, right? And I was saying, I don't particularly find myself compelled by the promise of eternal life. I actually find it kind of horrific in every way, not every way that I've been offered it. There is, I find the idea, the way that I could conceptualize eternal life would be something like theosis. But the way that it works in my mind, and obviously Jordan has already made the point that when we try to conceptualize these things, maybe we're already in a failure mode, and that's fair. But theosis gives me this idea that, okay, like I imagine myself as like, according to Michael Levin, there might be something it's like to be a skin cell in my finger. And the something that it's like to be a skin cell in my finger is not the same as it is like to be me. And the skin cell exists and it fulfills its purpose and it has its interiority. And then maybe it dies. And maybe in dying, it realizes that the whole time it was part of Rafe. And that changes its cognitive light cone about what it is in a really profound way. And then maybe that's our experience, right? We realize the oneness with God, right? It's like we cease being limited by this being what can contain our cognitive light cone. and we can maybe enter literally the mind that is the universe. And that mind remembers us, and it loves each and every one of us as individuals. And because of that, we're always retained within it. But the particularity and the way of experiencing disappears in some sense. That is comprehensible to me, right? It doesn't hurt. It's not scary to think about. But I also don't find it necessarily more comforting than just assuming that when I die, I simply disappear, right? The materialist idea that death is no different from pre-life uh, doesn't scare me at all. Or at least I don't think it does. I may be deeply mistaken, but I find the idea of eternal life as a living embodied agent quite terrifying. And I find the idea of being transformed into something that I couldn't recognize, some sort of pneumatic spiritual thing that wouldn't recognize my wife as the particular relationship that I have to my wife, that wouldn't recognize my children as a particular relationship that I have to my wife. I can't conceptualize that as me in any meaningful way. And this
Can
is
I?
where I get hung up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm never, Rafe, and I would just say people that are going to be wise spiritual directors in your life are not going to shortcut this opponent processing that you're going through
Yeah.
with like,
Okay, good.
bumper sticker answers. And I won't not claiming to be wise, but I won't do that for you either. I would say one thing that comes to mind as you're talking though is just even the nature of when we engage with the text, right? So I think what I hear you saying is as you actually got into the biblical text itself, you're finding that it there's a foreignness to it, and there's some things there that I go, I don't know how I feel about that. And here's what I'd say is just a point of like practical feedback about engagement with the text. This is an act of like hermeneutics, so if I were to send you guys an email that was just like encouragement and say, Rafe, man, I know you're like, hey, you started a business and I just want to give you some encouragement. Your future's bright. You're heading in this direction, etc. And you were to extrapolate from that, like metaphysics and ontology and all of these kind of like Greek philosophical categories from my email, I would probably come back to you and say, Rafe, that wasn't the point of my email, right? And I would say especially when we get to the New Testament, the primary purpose of the New Testament authors writing what they write is pastoral encouragement. It's to people in the midst of persecution. It's to the people in the face of Nero. I, I don't, this is my own engagement with it, right? I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else. I have learned to, for better or worse, care less about the metaphysics. And partially because I don't know if the metaphysics of what does eternal life look like ontologically, if that's what Paul or Peter or John have anywhere in their purview of their email communication to their original audience that I happen to be, privy to reading today. What I would say, like, here's my read, and this is my mode of engagement, Rafe. The way I read it is I'm giving my life to, Jordan talked about the city of Babel, and there's a juxtaposition in Revelation with like the harlot of Babylon and the city of God at the end. And there's an encouragement to those in the face of persecution in the first century to set their sights on the city of God. And that it will actually be by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, their story, that they are going to overcome Rome. They're going to overcome all that is evil in the world, and they will in some way, shape, or form have the hope of stepping into that city. What I extract from that is like existential personal encouragement is the things I'm giving my life to. I would say not every day, but I think I have a general thrust of like what I feel like is worth giving my life to is inching in whatever way I can, participating in God's renewing work to bring us a little bit closer to the city of God. And I have this hope. I know that I won't see it in my lifetime, but I have a sense that moving in that direction will be better for my kids and my grandkids. And that maybe I will hold out hope that when that project reaches its destination point and there is a sort of like setting right, all of these strange images that I think Jordan is right to say that we can't grasp in any particular way other than in the existential level of you want to be aimed in that direction. These images are orienting images. They're the arrow on that line, the directional arrows. I think that's worth it. I'm taking a kind of like Kierkegaardian leap of faith that to move creation, to move whatever little slice of life I've been entrusted with more towards the city of God, to participate in that is a worthwhile use of my life. And if I die without ever seeing the fulfillment of that, I have some strange hope that I get to see how the story ends. That's it for me. The metaphysics of it, I don't know. I have this hope that some way, shape, or form, the story I'm participating in, I'm in one chapter of it right now. I like to think I am playing a significant role in it. And my significant role is primarily expressed in my relationship with my wife, my children, the little slice of life I've been entrusted with. And that, I don't know, I have this hope that I get to see the end of the story somehow, even though my years will probably be hopefully 100, somewhere in that range. And that's it. That's it for me. That animates me, Rafe. I totally understand, like, I understand when you're saying, like, the questions that you're going through is a catechism right now. I won't shortcut those, and they're important and necessary. I'm just letting you know from where I stand, I think there's a place of going, living in mystery, holding out on, like, what was the perlocutionary intentions of those inspired authors, the pneuma that animated them, the text that I just so happened to get to read. And I think it's existential. I think it's an existential orientation more than a figuring out of the ontology of it all. Not to say there isn't good, the David Bentley Harts and the Bill Craigs of the world and the Alvin Plantingas, all those people that deal with the metaphysics, the Aquinas. There's value there, but I say for me, my only vantage point is it's worth the risk. It's worth the risk. I don't want Babylon. I want the city of God.
Hmm.
I don't know.
So,
Seems like a worthwhile.
So the raison of maybe calling us three together, at least a part of that was just settling for me, which is I've been through a number of these shifts, these loops, let's say, Rafe. And my variation is more Jobian, I think, than where you're at right now. But whatever, it moves. Every time the way that I thought it was going to play out, it does not play out to a degree to which makes me feel very bad in the moment that I'm actually here on Earth. I feel a tendency to want to be mad at God for not living up to my expectations, and many other variations on that theme, with which essentially if you kind of did a therapy group of Christians, I'm sure everybody would kind of nod their heads and say, yeah, I've got that one. I've been there down that road too. And so of course what then happens is when I look at it, I say, oh, so you're in that right now, meaning you're in the process of the existential metabolism of this problematic, of which some portion of it is you, because you're a person who is a systems thinker who also climbs and jumps, is thinking about it. Hey, I'm thinking about it. I'm trying to get this thing from a thinking perspective.
I'm going to wrestle with it for sure.
And then I'm going to do some jujitsu and I'll do it else. And God is like, yeah, great. Cause I've got whatever you're going through. It's like, yeah, there's a reason for that. And there'll be a point at which you'll have that expansion of self that naturally comes from wrestling with it. And in the expansion of self, that larger self suddenly can contain whatever it is you're currently metabolizing. You said it earlier, metabolizing is exactly the right frame. I put a link in the chat to a speech that Stephen DeYoung did at the Symbolic World Conference. I don't think you were there. I know you weren't that one. And it was about Nietzsche and the what's it called? Title. The title's actually pretty good. Friedrich Nietzsche's Guide to the Bodily Resurrection. And I mean, from my point of view, it's insanely brilliant. It's shocking to me that it hasn't been sort of all over the place. And you can tell that it was insanely brilliant because you had a room of like 300 people with, all kinds of folks who have been around the block quite a bit in absolute rapt attention for a solid hour, like a pin drop experience. So I would recommend it as a part of the process of, but it's a strong beverage in terms of metabolism. Don't take it on an empty stomach. Um, um, yeah, because this is the point, right? Because this is not a theoretic exercise. Hyper not a theoretic exercise, which is why it's so beautiful. Like when we are thrown into full engagement with every single moment, is laden with intensity. So therefore, the fact that you're struggling with the pieces that are before you is the nature of it. Like that's what it is. You're struggling with it because that's part of where you are right now. And I tell you what, I can say that right here, sitting here talking to you, and because you're
Yeah.
playing that role right now. But whatever, last night when I was like, why isn't my son sleeping? It's driving me crazy. Um, I wasn't exactly so quiescent because that's the nature of this finite aspect of being a person in this journey. Yeah, the image that keeps coming back to me though, and I can't maybe Paul, you've been around this a lot longer, but there's probably several of these, is the continuing remembering that it has nothing to do, like my expectation of a future state of affairs is in some very deep sense completely irrelevant. I would like X to occur, Y occurs. Irrelevant that Y occurred and
Mhm.
not X, because my ability to even begin to imagine what the right future would look like is effectively zero. To the degree to which I have achieved a closer relationship with God is, in fact, everything. Right? So I wanted to be king. I'm not king. In fact, I'm not just not king, I'm being torn apart by dogs, but I am closer to God. Okay. That's actually the thing. That's actually getting there. And so that creates a very, very weird tension because I'm actually closer to God here and now in reality. In fact, that is the nature of the fabric out of which reality is woven. And also, there's something about being quite indifferent to certain particulars of how that reality is showing up in the most material. Um, that's very intense challenge. Like there's a contradiction, and of course, immediately there's an ethical problem that flips around on that, which is how do you have any? Well, anyway, I don't even go there because, of course, the answer is pretty straightforward. Um,
So I I I like. I mean, there's something beautiful for me in the image that you lay out. I I rem, I recognize a kind of mystical connection to God in it, and in both of what you're saying. And I think, oh, these are really good ways to live life. And yet, where I struggle is this actually what the Bible proposes? Right? God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believeth in him may not die, but have eternal life. Right? Like I was asked at Estuary, do you believe in salvation? And I said, well, what are we being saved from, and what are we being saved for? Because the promise, as far as seems textually best supported, seems more like you're being saved from death and from sin, and for this kingdom to come, in which you are profoundly different than you are now. Um, I don't. I find those to be hard to 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 metabolize, to want to take on. Um, there's what I think I want to be saved for is to be saved into trust in, at the deepest level, the goodness of being. I had a I do this thing where I'll compose fantasy fiction stories when I'm falling asleep. And so I was doing this because I was having trouble sleeping one day. And I wanted to capture something that was felt very visceral. And one of my biggest fears, like, is I'm claustrophobic, being buried alive. Like, if you want to, like, have you guys ever seen the movie Rambo: First Blood when he's in the caves? Right, like that was like the most horrific movie I've ever seen. I was like dying on the edge of my seat. Right, so I was like, okay, I'm going to go there. And so I imagined myself in this. I imagined this character in this cave, and there's a cave in. And as I was imagining it, I fell asleep. And now it was me in the cave. And in the dream, what I realized was that people, that there was a whole team of people who were with me who were on the other side of the cave in. And they knew, almost certainly knew that there had been a cave in and they would be digging me out. But I was in a sufficiently small area that any effort that I put into digging myself out would just exhaust my air supply. And so the only thing that I could do was lay quietly and hope that they would dig me out before I ran out. And I asked myself if in that moment I could pray to God and have gratitude for the goodness of being. Can I love every moment of the sun's warmth on my skin, every moment of a breeze against me, every moment of seeing blue sky, every moment of rain, every moment of loving my wife, every moment of holding my children in my arms? And could I hold that, the goodness of being, sufficiently to accept my death or to accept my being saved from death in that moment? And what I knew was no, I would panic. I do not have enough faith in God. I would try to dig myself out and I would kill myself from my lack of patience. And so that was my okay, this is where I'm going to get spiritual guidance. And so when I pray every night, I still, even though I have all these doubts, I still read my Christian prayer sheet from my Orthodox church. And I think about what I'm grateful for that day. I think about the goodness of being. And then I think about my own sins and anything that I can do to live better. And then I ask this higher power than me to support me, because I know that I'm not capable of doing it entirely on my own, right? And then I think about the world and I think God is so far beyond my comprehension. And who am I to ask for any specific thing? I don't know what the hell's going on. Can I be an instrument of God's peace? Can it ripple just a little bit more through me loving my wife and my children and the people around me? That's all that I feel like I can do. And so that feels really salvific, let's say, and has been immensely powerful for me. But it feels so much about gratitude for what is. And as I look and when I read the Bible and hear that the cosmos is a carcass and what is of the flesh will die away, it seems to point to this other thing that I'm supposed to be oriented towards, which I don't necessarily want. And I think about this poem or this. Do you guys know the artist Jason Isbell?
Mhm. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing songwriter, beautiful Americana
Mhm.
artist. He wrote a song called "If We Were Vampires." If we were vampires and death was a joke, we'd go out on the sidewalk and smoke and watch and laugh at all the lovers and their plans, and I wouldn't feel the need to hold your hand. Maybe time running out is a gift, and I'll work hard to the end of my shift to give you every second I can find and hope it isn't me that's left behind.
Hmm.
Death, to me, is the constraint that allows life to be so intensely and deeply meaningful. So I don't know what it means to defeat death. I don't know what it means to be saved from death. And when I think about sin, I think sin means to miss the mark. And the only way to become somebody who can hit the mark over and over and over again is to have missed the mark thousands and thousands of times. And so I don't know how we separate the sin that is the necessary part of a developmental process from the sin, which there is this type of sin, which is the sin that begins a cascade of errors that takes us to hell.
Mhm. Yeah.
But we have to be able to articulate the distinction between these two things.
Mhm.
And
Like when my son is trying to learn how to walk, he fails a lot, but he does not at all separate from God in that failure.
Mhm.
So there's two different marks. One mark is the mark that you miss that is still properly held within the field of the presence of God. The other is the mark where you're actually moving, you're opposing your will to his will and therefore moving
Mhm.
away from him. And we cannot conflate those two.
Mhm.
I I I, uh, I went up into this beautiful creek and I took some psilocybin and I was sitting on the creek, and I was meditating. I was experiencing a lot of the pain that had happened in my family that had been passed down. I had this really profound experience of recognizing that even if my father and my mother and the man who abused me had left me with like unique burdens, right? Not everybody has to do some of the stuff that I've had to do to work through what happened to me. Each of them in their way actually really loved me. And in that love, they somehow gave me, I was gifted with some unique strengths. And so I was given maybe heavier burdens than some other people and less heavy burdens than a lot of people. But I was also given enough strength to carry the burdens that I was given. And so I was able to move from that pain and that grief into gratitude. And then I went down this creek and I was looking up at this incredibly beautiful canyon wall with the sun lit up it as I sat next to this creek. And I said to God, right? Like, if you need me, right? If you want to retain me after I die in some way that's important to you, I'll give my trust to you that whatever that plan is, you've got my best interest at heart and it'll be good.
Mhm.
Right. Whatever your idea of eternal life is for me, if you need that from me, great. I'll trust you because you've changed my life in so many powerful and beautiful ways. But it's not my prayer. My prayer is that while I'm alive, I can live it as fully as possible, accepting the reality of death and being able to love as deeply as possible.
You sound to me, Rafe, like someone that's in the way, like capital W. Like you,
Kingdom of heaven is at hand.
I, I don't, I don't hear anything, and I don't talk about much as in like public facing work because I try to keep these roles distinct. But as someone who serves in our local church as a pastor, if you came into my office, I would say, Rafe, you might be more on the way than you know. I don't have much to correct you on here. I don't have much to add to that. I feel like the thing that you just described is, um, yeah, no notes. I mean, like that is it, right? It is. You were living in the way, and this transformative, participatory realization that hit you in your core that was like, where this came from is goodness, and to goodness I will go. I mean, you've just distilled the gospel there. And I know like sometimes like getting into the granular details of digging through and reading the Bible cover to cover, and you're in like the Levitical laws, and then, you're in the middle of a dispute with Jesus and the Pharisees on like things about the law and the prophets. It gets really, really granular. And I just say, like, when I step out and I see you're zooming out here to the 5,000-foot view, you're walking in the way, man. Like, I I see it, and I think of, a couple things do come to mind. Like, I hear you processing the function of, I mean, how do I deal with like sin, the hardship of the world? And I thought a little bit of Tolkien's his creation myth. I think of the beginning of the Silmarillion, and I think of the song of discord that Melkor begins to play, and that God doesn't silence the song right away, but the promise is that he will weave that, even those seemingly discordant notes, as if like intended dissonance in jazz, it will be woven into the tapestry of the song of creation in such a way that the end of the song, when we get to it, and that's for me, like circling back around to my hope. My hope is like I get to see the composition of the song of creation. I get to hear it somehow in its fullness in some way, shape, or form. I don't get the metaphysics of that. I don't get whatever bodily resurrection is signifying to me. It's signifying something akin to that you get to step into seeing and hearing that song in its completion at the end of that particular song. And that moves me in some sense, but similar to what Jordan is saying, it doesn't. There's a paradox here. the paradox for me is that day to day, I guess I don't think much about uh, the age to come. I think about where I see the way, and the way that's narrow that leads to life, and I see the wide way that leads to destruction, and I'm trying to discern which one's the wide way and the narrow way. And I step into the narrow way, and when I do that, I'm met with that same grace, the grace of that brings about all those things you give gratitude for at the end of the day. You know, the thing that's beyond your control, the thing that you have some agency in participating in, and yet is simultaneously what you said, trapped in that cave or trapped in that confining space of like, it will require something beyond me to bring me out of this, and I have to entrust myself to that.
Mm.
Yeah.
That for me is behind all of the symbolic language. When I see Matthew or Paul or New Testament author or writing about some sort of future hope, it is to communicate to those in the first century who were trapped all around with the spirit of Babylon, right? That is their cave. It is the thing that feels so far beyond them. You are under the full power of an empire where you're saying Jesus is Lord, they're saying Caesar is Lord, and you're living in the midst of that, and there is some hope that you should continue on as if Jesus is Lord in the face of Caesar is Lord, trusting that it's not like I'm scraping my way out of this cave or this pit. I'm not digging myself out of it as much as I'm not giving into despair, right? So there's a
Mhm.
place between overemphasizing our agency, and then we move into the role of God, and under trusting that God is with us,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
that from that place I act. I mean, you've nailed. I mean, like, think of all the insights. I think you get this. I don't know if listeners get this. This might be too esoteric. I think you get this from what you've gone through in your marriage, right? That you were
Mm.
so gracious to share with all of us, Rafe. That you got that there was I'm not. I can't fight to control this thing. I am entrusting it to grace. And if I walk in this way and the way is narrow and it leads to life, I can entrust that what emerges out of it will be life, but I can't control it. I think you've gotten that in a way that is deeply, deeply powerful, man. And I thought about it for weeks. I thought about it in my own marriage. Uh, it's a caught, not taught sort of thing, you
Mhm.
know?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know if
Nice.
any of that makes sense.
Well, I can
Eh,
say that when you were speaking about your journey through the valley of the shadow of death, Rafe, I guess because I had mentioned, I had the image of my son learning how to walk, and what the feeling I had was the feeling of you speaking to the Father,
mhm.
and the Father being very encouraged by his son, you,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
saying, "Yes." You saying, I want to live this life. If you have more for me, I will do as your will, but I want to live this life fully." And God going, "Yes, that is exactly right. That is not, there is no sin in that. You are walking the path precisely that I have put before you. And the way that you're walking that path is exactly the way that I want you to right now. Um, and there will be stumbling blocks on that path. But that's the story. And I would say, hmm, as like a little a tidbit, and I'm sure you've experienced this already many times, and Paul, countless times. I imagine I've read. Let's go with like Romans, probably now 10 times, and it's different every time I read it. And things that used to stick in my craw just completely shift. Sometimes I'll actually have like I was reading. I guess I was reading Exodus a while back, and there was a particular scene I was like really pissed off about it. And I sat down and chatted with a friend of mine, and he just gave me like one word, one slightly different perspective, and my entire point of view flipped, like completely flipped. And I was like, oh, it totally makes sense. And a huge, big chunk of stuff came into place. And so, as you said, we and I are like so early in this thing that the process of running into stuff and then having like gristle get caught in your teeth is going to happen. And it's just going to keep happening because there's so much self growth, so much becoming more and shedding things and growing into things that is part of the journey, that the kind of the text becomes something that you can only just grapple with and chew on and learn how to and spit up a lot. We'll just be babies still, as you're building a digestive system in the first place. And maybe the last bit, which is my wife and I were both afforded an opportunity when she was giving birth to our son to encounter something like the dream you had of being in the cave-in. And you never know how you will face death until you're actually facing death. And what I would say is something like, it was rather shocking to discover that the presence of God is such a salve, like salvation and just salve, that an experience that could otherwise be existentially harrowing and certainly drive one to panic, you actually feel the diminution of that just because you can feel that the God is there. And it's weird. I'm saying it has nothing to do with will. It has nothing to do with belief or desire on your part. But when you are face to face with the reality of death, you suddenly notice, oh, wait, I'm actually held by something that is much, much, much larger. And almost because you've cultivated that relationship, you can just name who it is. And you notice a quality of peace that you would be able to, you would be in the moment of that dream, and you would actually feel something in you wanting to dig out, and you'd feel something much, 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 much bigger holding you in a reality of peace that would bring you closer to that sweetness of life. And then the hole would be dug open.
I think, yeah, I mean, my sense, like, that was maybe what I experienced when my marriage collapsed, was that I found that thing that could hold me and that could guide me and that could keep me acting virtuously instead of trying to dig my way out in a way that was not going to help, right? Maybe digging my way out was trying to find another woman or something like that. And I was able to not do that. And it wasn't, it felt very given to me as opposed to arising from within me. And yet I'm not certain that I would have the same thing in another circumstance, right? It's like the spiritual strength to open yourself to God and see and feel God. And I admire that in, the Christian martyrs, right? That you can be burned to death and sing to God as you die. And we see that in other faiths too, though. But God, but there is a capacity in the human being to be open to something that is salvific. But yeah, I'm hung up on what the salvation means right now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Means
We
not
won't.
in the life, right? Like,
Yeah.
right. It was really funny. Like, I was talking at this estuary, and they were like, it's too hard, right? To do the thing that brings you to eternal life. And it's like, no, that's the good part, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way Christianity brings you to virtue, that's the benefit for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
The promise of eternal life is the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Can I throw something else in to just kind of like land the plane in a practical way here?
Yeah.
I would suggest this. John Vervaeke, talks about Philea Sophia and Philea Nikeia. I feel right now the Philea Sophia happening. I feel a conversation happening on a different registry. I feel it mediated somehow through zeros and ones on our screens. The pneuma that holds, that's there present, the God that in Christ is holding all things together. I feel it in our conversation now. And the thing I would say is, like, there are conversations that we can have about God that happen in a different registry that actually don't lead to life. And we can use signifying words like Jesus. We can use signifying words like salvation. But the goal of those conversations might be Philea Nikeia. And when those happen, Rafe, I I would just say it's probably just best to, like, there can be some value to them. I won't limit the work of grace from God being able to do stuff in that as well. But I'd say they're generally less beneficial than finding a way to stay in this registry. You know, I feel it. Like I will hang up. We're not even on a phone. My grammar needs to be updated. I don't know what we do. Click, leave. When I hang up,
Derez.
D yeah, I will I will feel the holdovers of speaking in this registry together, in this particular dialect together, in Vervaeke's Dialogos together. I will feel that, and when I go have a conversation with my wife and kids, I wanna be in that registry. The thing I'm sharing with you guys, I wanna stay in that registry. To me, that is the manifestation of the pattern of Christ. It is the kenosis, the self-emptying, the mutual, the listening. I hope you feel listened to, Rafe. I hope you feel listened to, Jordan. I hope, you don't feel I'm preaching at you in any way. I wanna operate in that registry, and in some sense, like, I just have a trust that the more I operate in that registry, because I feel the goodness in it, the more I trust the emergent goodness to come out of it, just living in the way. Like, I feel the way. I feel that there's 10,000 different terms we could use to describe what I feel in this registry, and, I'm thankful for you both for your ability to speak in this registry, to me, signifies an adherence to the pattern of patterns. And that, for me, Rafe, that's salvation.
Okay.
Cut. That's great.
I I feel a sense that we're coming towards the end here. And I think, thank you guys very much for being here with me. Um, for inviting me, Paul, and inviting Jordan to be part of this conversation. Uh, I guess what I want to name here, kind of at the end, just what I'm noticing myself is that there was that moment where I was like, I was in the struggle, I was in the fight. It wasn't that I want to fight you or fight Christ, but
No, I
like
didn't
that's
don't
the
feel that at
energy
all.
that
Yep.
arises. Somewhere in there it switches, and it really feels like almost a it's a tenderness that has a lot of grief to it. And I've noticed that the capacity to grieve the pain of being is somehow uh, really, really, it opens the channel. That's when I've felt like I can get. That's when I feel like I can get a clear signal from Christ is when I'm allowing myself to be opened in that channel. Um, and then there's this very interesting thing, which is that it's almost like grief carves the pathway that joy can occupy.
Yes. Mhm. What's the
Yeah.
line? What's the line in the beginning of that creation story? The beauty of the song was that bound it was filled with immeasurable sorrow. That's a slight paraphrase, but the beauty was inextricable from the song having a degree of sorrow in it. That's a weird these paradoxes, right? But you get it when you're in it, and that's Kierkegaard's point. Kierkegaard argued, that we are finding the authentic self is the synthesis of the finite with the infinite. The only doorway in that is through stepping into the paradox, because paradoxes can only be resolved from within. And the doorway in is that measure of faith, not blind faith in a set of propositions, but what we're doing now. What I feel is if I open up to you, Rafe, and I lay my cards on the table and I say, I'm making myself vulnerable, and then it gets reciprocated, that's faith. That like stepping in like together. And that's where weirdly like the paradoxes find not like right brain or left brain resolution, I should say, but they find some way of making what seems incongruent somehow congruent. and it's in the midst of it. So, yeah. So I wanna have my conversations with my wife like that, and I don't. I wanna have conversations with my children in that space, and I don't. Um, uh, that's,
Okay.
I guess that's repentance, right? You know,
Nice.
at the end of the day going like, where did have that gap? Where was I not operating that registry? Where did I not open that channel or allow the channel to be open because I was afraid or I felt like I needed to be in control or all of these things that don't lead to life. And then tomorrow, Spirit of God help me to walk in that way. I don't know. It seems like a good place to be.
I agree.
Jordan, would you like to put a bow on anything as I see, as you look up?
Oh, it's so painful.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the image that I was having that I'm trying to figure out how to put it into words is, we're in the end, in the end scenes of That Hideous Strength, and this way, this register, this dialect, it is the only way. Um, Everything that's happening is happening precisely to the degree to which people are not engaging in this way. And only by showing up and engaging in this way is any actual life possible. We're
Yes.
in that we're in that cave. The cave has fallen.
Well, thank you guys. I'm gonna leave uh, better than where I was before the conversation began. Appreciate. I think Jordan, when I sent an email, you said something akin to, "It sounds challenging. That seems like it might be worth it," or something like that. So for both of you to enter into this conversation in that space, if thank you. These last couple conversations, your openness is uh it's it's something else, and it's hard to stay in that place. But I thank you for modeling that to me and being willing to step into a conversation in the liminal space and to work through it with hopefully people you feel like, though we don't have close proximity physically to each other, that there's a good degree of trust there, and I feel that with both of you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very high trust. And you guys
Thank
are
you, Pastor Paul.
remarkable humans to be able to have these conversations with.